This video is the third and final part of my series on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. If you haven't already watched part 2, you can do so by clicking this link. Nietzsche believed that ancient Greece had produced the healthiest culture on earth. This culture began to decline with Socrates. In his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, he recognized Socrates and Plato as symptoms of decay, as agents of the dissolution of Greece, as pseudo-Greek, as anti-Greek. To understand why Nietzsche thought this, we must turn to Cicero's work, Concerning Fate. In this work, Cicero describes Socrates' encounter with the Greek physiognomist, Zopyrus. Like most of the ancient Greeks, Zopyrus believed that morality and aesthetics were inseparable. He therefore believed that he could discover men's entire characters and natures from their body, eyes, face, and brow. After looking at Socrates' ugly face, Zopyrus concluded that he was stupid and thick-witted. He also accused Socrates of a number of vices. Socrates accepted that he was naturally inclined to the vices that Zopyrus named, but claimed to have overcome them through reason. Nietzsche attaches a great deal of significance to this story. Like both the ancient Greeks and the criminologists of his own time, Nietzsche believed that ugliness was a sign of degeneration. To quote him, Socrates belonged to the lowest of the low. Socrates was mob. You know, and you can still see it for yourself, how ugly he was. But ugliness, which in itself is an objection, was almost a refutation among the Greeks. Was Socrates really a Greek? Ugliness is not infrequently the expression of thwarted development, or of development arrested by crossing. In other cases, it appears as a decadent development. Nietzsche then makes an allusion to the work of Cesare Lombroso, saying, "The anthropologists among the criminal specialists declare that the typical criminal is ugly, a monster in face, a monster in soul." Was Socrates a typical criminal? These remarks are consistent with the dominant discourse on degeneration during Nietzsche's time. Like the ancient Greeks and the physicians of the 19th century, Nietzsche believes that one's outer appearance is connected to their character. Nietzsche goes on to write, "When the physiognomist had revealed to Socrates what he was, a cave of every evil lust, the great ironist uttered a phrase that provides the key to him. 'That is true,' he said, 'but I have become master of them all.'" How did Socrates become master of himself? The answer, in short, is through reason. Socrates believed that reason was a greater force than physiology. In other words, one could overcome their physiological tendencies through thought. Unlike his contemporaries, he did not believe in the link between morality and aesthetics. He challenged and successfully defeated the Greek ideal of kalokagavia. He replaced the equation virtue equals power equals beauty with reason equals virtue equals happiness. Nietzsche describes this Socratic formula as the bizarrest of equations and one which has in particular all the instincts of the older Hellenes against it. With Socrates, Greek taste undergoes a change in favor of dialectics. Reason is elevated above the body, and virtue is equated with happiness. The virtuous man becomes one who resorts to clarity, severity, and logicality as weapons against the ferocity of the drives. Whatever is not in accord with reason became false, and the individual who could not justify himself according to conscious thought became a fool. After Socrates, Greek culture turned from the external world to the internal world, from physics to ethics. It stopped focusing on the problems of nature, evolution, and the body, and started focusing on those of metaphysics and morals. Greek culture no longer valued the beautiful and powerful man. Instead, the rational man, the dialectician, became the most noble type. After Socrates, the Greeks began to focus on the mind rather than the body. This fact is reflected in Greek art. To quote the historian Will Durant, "In male statutory, the head and face took on more importance, the body less. The study of character replaced the idolatry of muscle." In short, the foundation of Greek culture shifts from the body to the mind with Socrates. Nietzsche believes this shift was a mistake. Nietzsche believed that the foundational values of European man had made him sick. These values had their roots in ancient Greece and Christianity. In other words, Socrates and Jesus. We've already discussed Socrates. We will now discuss Jesus. But first, we must discuss the culture that Jesus grew out of, namely, ancient Jewish culture. The significance of the Jewish people, said Nietzsche, is that they mark the beginning of the slave rebellion in morals. To appreciate this point, we must turn to the most central story of Judaism, namely, the Jewish exodus from Egypt. Egypt was the autocratic regime par excellence. Its main symbol was the pyramid, which represented sacred hierarchy. The pharaoh, who was at the top of the pyramid, was worshipped as a god. The Jews, by contrast, were at the bottom of the pyramid, and therefore treated like cattle. They were, in other words, viewed as the tools of their masters, with no inherent value in themselves. The Jews revolted against this bondage, not by taking up arms, but by claiming that all men were created in the image of God. If all men are created in the image of God, one is obligated to appreciate every human as a manifestation of the divine. One should, therefore, show compassion to the less fortunate, save the weak, feed the starving, and give to the poor. For there is something divine in even the lowliest. This revolutionary idea is diametrically opposed to the Egyptian treatment of slaves. For Nietzsche, it is a moment of the profoundest perversity in the history of values. To quote him, "It was the Jews who, rejecting the aristocratic value equation, good equals noble, equals powerful, equals beautiful, equals happy, equals blessed, ventured with awe-inspiring consistency to bring about a reversal and held it in the teeth of the most unfathomable hatred, the hatred of the powerless, saying, only those who suffer are good, only the poor, the powerless, the lowly are good, the suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people, the only ones saved. Salvation is for them alone, whereas you rich, the noble and powerful, you are eternally wicked, cruel, lustful, insatiate, godless. You will also be eternally wretched, cursed, and damned." In other words, they defined themselves in opposition to the Egyptian pyramid. The goodness of the Jews did not derive, as had been entirely natural until then, by projecting power in direct combat with others, but by focusing attention away from physical conflict, an area where they could not compete, and towards an arena in which they alone could command respect and gain mastery, the realm of strict habits and ascetic ritual practice. Unlike the pharaoh, they lived simply. They did not hurt or enslave other people. They did not sleep with lots of women. They avoided luxury and extravagant excess. In other words, they became good by avoiding everything the pharaoh did. In so doing, they turned the Egyptian pyramid on its head. What was high became low, and what was low became high. Jew became good, and pharaoh became evil. This fact informs Jewish symbolism. If one superimposes the triangular symbol of the pyramid with its inversion, they have the Star of David, the symbol of Judaism. Exodus is not just about a group of slaves managing to extricate themselves from bondage. It represents a transformation of the basic understanding of life. Instinctually, power and strength appear to be good things. Osama bin Laden famously said, "When people see a strong horse and a weak horse, by nature, they will like the strong horse." In other words, people are naturally inclined to accept the aristocratic equation, good equals noble, equals powerful, equals beautiful, equals happy, equals blessed. But the Jews rejected the aristocratic value equation and replaced it with a new one, namely, poor equals deprived, equals powerless, equals humble, equals good. The Jews revolted against the pharaoh by falsifying nature and reality. To quote Nietzsche, the price they had to pay was the radical falsification of all nature, of all naturalness, all reality. They defined themselves counter to all of those conditions under which a nation was able to live, was permitted to live. They made of themselves the contradiction of their natural values. For Nietzsche, the ancient Jewish culture rejected natural biological inclinations and impulses. In other words, it rejected life as will to power. They saw people who lived in accordance with the will to power, whether it be the Egyptians, the Hellenes, or the Romans, as evil. In short, they falsified reality in order to feel better about themselves. Nietzsche considers this falsification a symptom of sickness. To quote him once again, "I consider life itself instinct for growth, for durability, for accumulation of forces, for power. Where the will to power is lacking, there is decline." In addition to rejecting the will to power, the Jews rejected the Hellenistic conception of the body, which was discussed in part 2 of this video series on Nietzsche. Following the period of Alexander the Great's conquest, Hellenization spread like wildfire across the East. Greek institutions, such as the gymnasium, began to appear in Damascus, Samaria, and Alexandria. The Hellenistic administration in Jerusalem built a gymnasium right next to the Jewish temple. This act was abhorred by the vast majority of Palestinian Jews. From the earliest portions of the book of Genesis, nudity was associated with sin. The Jews believed that the naked body was something to be ashamed of. This stands in stark contrast to the Hellenistic view of the body, which associated nakedness with honesty and godliness. When the Greeks began training nude next to the Jewish temple, they were met with intense religious opposition. Indeed, the establishment of the gymnasium in Jerusalem would ultimately lead to a deadly conflict between the Jews and the Greeks. This ancient conflict illustrates a much broader point. The Jewish tradition is strongly opposed to nudity. It believes that the body is something to be hidden. The Greek tradition, by contrast, has looked upon the naked body favorably. The conflict between the Hellenic and Hebraic view of the body has raged within European culture for over 2,000 years. The Jewish tradition has been dominant for most of that time, but the Greek tradition has often reasserted itself, especially within sculpture and painting. Hellenic rule of Judea was eventually replaced by Roman rule. Once again, an explicitly non-warrior caste found itself in conflict with a warrior caste. Nietzsche considers this the most important conflict in human history. To quote him, "Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. Up to now, there has been no greater event than this battle, this question, this contradiction of mortal enemies." According to Nietzsche, the Jews won this conflict. To quote him, "Which of them has prevailed for the time being, Rome or Judea? But there is no trace of doubt. Just consider to whom you bow down in Rome itself, today as though to the embodiment of the highest values, and not just in Rome, but over nearly half of the earth, everywhere where man has become tame or wants to become tame. To 3 Jews, as we know, and 1 Jewess, to Jesus of Nazareth, Peter the fisherman, Paul the carpet weaver, and the mother of Jesus first mentioned, whose name was Mary." The Jews were able to defeat their oppressors not through force of arms, but through religion, more precisely, the Christian religion. Through Christianity, the Jews managed to convert their Roman oppressors to a value system that undermined Roman militarism. Christianity promotes meekness, humility, and pacifism. These values are not compatible with empire, and so Rome fell. In addition to leading to the fall of Rome, Nietzsche believes that Christianity is responsible for the degeneration of European man in the 19th century. To quote him, "Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, ill-constituted. It has made an idea out of opposition to the preservative instincts of strong life. It has depraved the reason even of the intellectually strongest natures by teaching man to feel the supreme values of intellectuality as sinful, as misleading, as temptations." Nietzsche decries the ethics of Christianity, which advocate compassion for the less fortunate members of society. He claims that this is a violation of the natural order and an impediment to the progress of the species. To quote him once again, "Pity on the whole thwarts the law of evolution, which is the law of selection. It preserves what is ripe for destruction. It defends life's disinherited and condemned. Through the abundance of the ill-constituted of all kinds which it retains in life, it gives life itself a gloomy and questionable aspect." Identical thoughts are to be found in Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche claims that Christianity as a whole has worked with such conviction and a good conscience for the preservation of everything sick and suffering, that is to say, to work in deed and in truth for the degeneration of the European race. Turn all evaluations upside down, that is what they had to do, and shatter the strong, debilitate the great hopes, question any joy and beauty, take everything autocratic, masculine, triumphant, tyrannical, all the instincts that belong to the highest and best formed species of human. Like many other intellectuals during his time, Nietzsche believed that Europe was in a state of decay and decline, but unlike other intellectuals, he did not attribute this decline to modernity. Instead, he sees the 19th century as the apotheosis, the culmination of a long process of decay which began with the rise and eventual hegemony of Christianity. In Nietzsche's time, this hegemony was beginning to break down. People were finding it increasingly difficult to believe in God. They did not, however, reject Christian ethics. Indeed, many believed that the ethics of Christian civilization could still be retained, despite the divine source of their authority having been abolished. Many Christian notions, such as the infinite value of each human life made in God's image, found secular expression in 19th century movements such as socialism, democracy, and the battle for human rights. Nietzsche detested these movements. If God is nothing but a delusion, then his commandments too are no less fictional. The idea that all men are created in the image of God, which is the basis for modern human rights, is nothing but Christian dogma. A dogma that had, in Nietzsche's opinion, led to the degeneration of European civilization and man. Nietzsche believed that Europe was on the threshold of a new era, one in which philosophers would abandon their dogmatism and reject accepted truths. He hoped that the death of God would lead European man to embrace a new form of morality, a morality that was informed by biology rather than a morality that was against biology. A morality, in other words, informed by knowledge of the body, of medicine, of breeding techniques, of athletic training techniques, and so forth. Nietzsche believed that this revolution in morality would lead to a new European Renaissance. Ancient Greek knowledge of the body that had been rediscovered in the 19th century would lead to mankind's next evolutionary leap. Thanks for watching.